Motor torpedo boat was the name given to fast torpedo boats by the Royal Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy. The motor in the formal designation, referring to the use of petrol engines, was to distinguish them from the majority of other naval craft that used steam turbines or reciprocating steam engines. The capitalized term is generally used for the Royal Navy boats and abbreviated to MTB. During the Second World War, the U.S. Navy boats were usually called by the hull classification symbol of PT, and are covered under PT boat, although the class type were still motor torpedo boats. German motor torpedo boats of the Second World War were called S-boot by the Kriegsmarine and E-boats by the Allies. Italian MTBs of this period were known as Motoscaf or Armato Silurante. French MTBs were known as Vedettes Lance Torpilles. Soviet MTBs were known as. After the end of the war in 1945, a number of the Royal Navy's MTBs were stripped and the empty hulls sold for use as houseboats. History: MTBs were designed for high-speed operating at night, low-speed ambush and maneuverability on the water. This was to enable them to get close enough to launch the torpedoes at enemy vessels. With next to no armor, the boats relied upon surprise and their agility at high speed to avoid being hit by gunfire from bigger ships. The British and Italian navies started developing such vessels in the early 20th century, shortly before the beginning of the First World War. Italian mass boats were comparatively small, at 20 to 30 tons displacement. Mass 15 was the only motor torpedo boat in history to sink a battleship, the Austro-Hungarian vessel Szentistván in 1918. British torpedo boats of the First World War were small at only around 15 tons and were known as coastal motor boats. In the Second World War, British MTBs were operated by coastal forces. A similar size boat with a different role in the Second World War was the BPB 63 feet high-speed launch used by the RAF. The last MTBs in the Royal Navy were the two Brave-class fast patrol boats of 1958, which were capable of 50 knots. Specification: many boats were built with a MTB designation but varied substantially. A 55-footer capable of 40 knots was shown in 1930. Vosper private venture boat. The Vosper private boat was designed by Commander Peter Duquesne CBE, the managing director of Vosper Limited. In 1936, she was completed and launched in 1937. She was bought by the Admiralty and taken into service with the Royal Navy as MTB 102. Length: 68 feet. Beam: 19 feet 9 in. Draft: 3 feet 9 in. Power plant: 3 Isotofroscini 57-liter petrol engines. Power: 3,300 horsepower. Speed: 48 knots, 43 knots. Crew: 2 officers, 10 men. Armament: 221 in torpedo tubes. MTB 102 was the fastest wartime British naval vessel in service. She was at Dunkirk for the evacuation and carried Winston Churchill and Dwight Eisenhower when they reviewed the fleet before the invasion of Normandy. British power boat 60 feet MTB. They were based on the British power boat rescue craft and were originally designed for the Royal Air Force but reduced to 60 feet in length. They could carry two 18-inch torpedoes and achieve a maximum speed of 33 knots. The Royal Navy ordered the first in 1936. These entered service as MTB numbers Chapter 1 to 12 and 14 to 19. In the early days of the war, they were painted with different numbers and photos distributed to the press to give the impression the Royal Navy had more than they actually did. One photo was sent to the American monthly Popular Science showing the number 23. Vosper 70 feet motor torpedo boat. Although various boat lengths were produced by Vosper for the Royal Navy, the 70 feet boat was produced from 1940. The design was produced with modifications as MTBs 31 to 40, 57 to 66, 73 to 98, 222 to 245, 347 to 362, 380 to 395, and 523 to 537. Using 3 Packard Marine engines, they were capable of around 37 knots. Early models carried two 21-inch torpedo tubes, two 0.50 in machine guns and two 0.303 in machine guns. They could also carry 4 depth charges. Between 1943 and 1945, 2 Vosper designs appeared, the Vosper Type 1 73 feet, and the Type 2. Vosper Type 1 length, 73 feet, engine, 3 Packard 12M engines for a total of 4,200 horsepower, speed, 40 knots, range, 470 nm at 20 knots, displacement, 47 t, armament, 4 18-inch torpedo tubes alike on 20 mm cannon, 2 0.303 in Vickers K machine guns. Crew, 13. Vosper Type 2. This design remained in use after the war. Length 73 feet, engine 4,200 horsepower, speed 40 knots, range 480 nm at 20 knots, displacement 49 t, armament 2 18-inch torpedoes QF6PD Armark IA 20 mm alike on 2 0.303 Vickers MG, crew 13. Canadian MTBs. These boats were used by the Royal Canadian Navy 29th MTB Flotilla. Originally designed as motor gun boats carrying a 6-pounder to engage enemy small craft, they were redesignated motor torpedo boats. Scott Payne Type G 70-foot boat. Manufacturer British Power Boats. High displacement 55 tons. Overall length 72 feet 6 inches, breadth 20 feet 7 inches, draft 5 feet 8 inches. Maximum speed 38 to 41 knots. Armament auto-loading QF 6-pounder gun, 2 21-inch torpedo tubes .303 or 50 Vickers machine guns, 20 mm alike on a 40 mm Bofors gun. Power plant, 3 Rolls-Royce Packard 14M supercharged V12 engines, 3 shafts. Power 3,750 horsepower total. Range 260 km. Radius of action at 25 knots. Crew. Post-war usage. After the end of World War II, a number of Royal Navy vessels were stripped and sold for use as houseboats. These included motor gun boats as well as MTBs. Many of these were moored in Langston Harbour, Littlehampton, Hayling Island and Wootton Creek, although most have now disappeared from these locations. Nowadays most MTB houseboats can be found at Shoreham by Sea, Cobden Bridge and Bembridge.